Using creative financing techniques. People often ask me which creative real estate technique I would recommend that they use when they're purchasing a property. Well, I like to give them a magic answer. The truth is that the best real estate technique is the one that works. As a matter of fact, some of my most profitable transactions have been created using a combination of techniques. For instance, you can combine a seller second mortgage with a new first mortgage to get the financing you need to purchase a property. Or you can even assume an existing loan coupled with a seller second mortgage and then refinance to get a better rate or to take cash out of the transaction. When you feel that the seller is inflexible but the property is too good to pass up, you might consider partnering with another investor. As you see in my course, there is a creative options guide, or a cog chart as I call it, that lists variables involved in the property, both for the buyer and seller. These variables can be cross-indexed on the chart with my creative techniques. When you compare the variables and the techniques, you can get a preliminary direction on what techniques to use when you're purchasing a property. Now, some real estate investors develop tunnel vision when they initially succeed. By that I mean if a wraparound mortgage worked for them once, for example, they believe it should work again and again. Unfortunately, all properties and sellers are not cut from the same cloth. By developing your creative problem-solving skills, you can determine which techniques would work best for each transaction. Creative real estate investing is not new. I've been able to trace it back at least 50 years to William Zeckendorf in New York City. Bill Zeckendorf bought the Empire State Building, then he spun off segments of the property to investment groups. For example, he sold the land to one group, the building to another group, the air rights to another group, the personal property to another group, and he made a lot of money doing that. Creative financing. There are multiple opportunities to use your own creativity to purchase property, and I believe my techniques are powerful and flexible enough for anyone to use, whether you're a novice or a seasoned investor. In this audio chapter, I'm going to discuss 19 specific creative financing techniques that have been developed from the principles I described in the previous chapter on developing creative financing techniques, and how to combine various techniques to overcome obstacles to purchasing property. So let's get started. Over the years, I've used the concepts I described in the previous chapter to develop creative financing techniques that have proven to be very successful. Although you can develop an unlimited number of techniques with the concept I've described, I want to present to you 19 proven techniques that I or my students have used over and over for years. Let's talk about the first technique, combining a new first mortgage and a seller second mortgage. This technique involves combining an institutional or a private loan with seller financing to create a no-money-down purchase strategy. Many institutional lenders have designed programs in which they'll finance 80 to 95% of the purchase and allow the seller to provide a second mortgage for the balance of the purchase price, resulting in 100% financing. You should also note that many lenders also offer 100% financing, although generally at higher interest rates. Now, for easy access to mortgage lenders, visit my website, carltonsheets.com. For this technique, create a situation in which you obtain an institutional or private loan for 80% of the proposed purchase price. The loan approval provides that you may borrow the balance from the seller. You negotiate a purchase where the seller will provide the balance of the financing. The sources you will need to use are an institutional or private lender and the seller. The strategy you will employ is to take out a new first mortgage on the property and obtain financing from the seller to cover the balance of the purchase price. Let's look at how the situation, source, and strategy come together in this example. The seller of a home valued at $150,000 has an existing loan of $80,000 and is looking for a full-price offer, but is willing to accept a $30,000 mortgage over 10 years at 5% interest. To use this technique, here's what you do. First, obtain a new first mortgage for $120,000 or 80% of the purchase price. This loan amount would pay off the seller's $80,000 mortgage and provide the seller with $40,000 cash at closing, less any closing expenses or charges. Next, give the seller a second mortgage in the amount of $30,000. Now, in addition to the funds received at closing, the seller has a note and mortgage secured by the property that will be paid in full in 10 years. The seller has been able to get the full asking price, and you have bought a property with no money down. If you encounter difficulty obtaining the new first mortgage, you may look to the seller. Some sellers have been known to join the buyer in signing a note and mortgage. If the buyer does not have sufficient credit to get a new mortgage, the seller in effect loans his or her credit to the buyer. The property is then transferred after the new loan is in place. You could even use the credit of an equity partner to secure the financing, in return for which the partner would receive a percentage of the ownership. Okay, the next technique combines assumption and seller second mortgage. This technique involves assuming an existing loan on the property and taking out a second loan with the seller for the balance. When you assume a mortgage, you take on the seller's obligation to pay. Accordingly, you must be certain to understand the terms of the mortgage and the note that you're assuming. The interest rate, outstanding balance, and the loan terms are major factors in determining your cash flow or resale profit. When you assume a loan, you inherit the seller's loan terms, whether they're good or bad. Obviously, this technique works best when the seller's mortgage has a desirable fixed interest rate with no impending rate increase or balloon payment due. The seller might or might not be released from the responsibility of paying on the loan, depending on whether your assumption is qualified or unqualified. If your assumption is qualified, the lender will likely review your credit and income. If the lender does not qualify you to replace the seller, you may still be able to assume the loan. However, the lender will not release the seller from the responsibility to pay on the debt. In other words, if you default, the lender will seek to recover from both you and the seller. In any case, with an assumption, you avoid many of the loan costs that are customarily charged when you create a new loan. The second component of this technique involves obtaining seller financing for the balance of the purchase price. The two mortgages you create cover the entire purchase price. You may offer a seller the upper end of the property's value to encourage flexibility. For this technique, the situation is that you want to buy a property that has an assumable mortgage without using a down payment. The seller is flexible and willing to take a second mortgage on the property for the balance. The sources are an institutional or private lender and the seller. The strategy is to assume the seller's first mortgage and give the seller a second mortgage for the balance of the purchase price, the seller's equity. Let's take a look at an example. Assume you find a home on the market for $150,000 that has an existing assumable mortgage of $75,000. The seller is willing to finance a portion of the purchase price. The seller is more concerned with getting his or her full asking price than receiving cash at closing. To use this technique, you would, first, assume a $75,000 mortgage on the property. Second, offer the seller a second mortgage for the balance of the purchase price, which is $75,000. In this case, you end up with two mortgages, the assumed first mortgage and the second mortgage given to the seller, but you have purchased the property with no money down. In the next technique, I'm going to be talking about combining assumption, seller second mortgage, and refinancing a loan. This technique involves assuming the loan on a mortgage property, obtaining seller financing by offering an attractive rate of return, and refinancing at a later time, perhaps even right away, at a more desirable rate. This technique resolves two common obstacles faced by no-money down buyers. First is obtaining a purchase loan without a down payment. The requirements for obtaining a refinance loan differ from a purchase loan. The amount loaned to refinance is based on the property's appraised value. This amount may be substantially larger than the initial purchase price, thus allowing the borrower to obtain a higher loan amount with a refinance loan than with a purchase loan. As long as the amount loaned covers the existing liens, the borrower does not have to bring money to the closing and might actually take cash out at closing. Although there are some refinance loan programs that don't require the borrower to have owned the property for a specified period of time, many programs require that the borrower own the property for at least a year. In this case, it's known as a seasoning requirement. Armed with the knowledge that you will be able to quickly refinance the property, you can be more aggressive in your negotiations with the seller. You may be able to overcome the seller's objection to provide financing by offering premium interest rates. For this technique, the situation is that the seller does not require cash at closing and is willing to wait for the portion of the purchase price not assumed, providing a premium rate of interest is paid. The source is an institutional or private lender and the seller. The strategy is to have a mortgage broker verify how long you must own the property before you'll be eligible for a refinance loan. Ask the seller to assist in financing your purchase and offer a premium rate of interest on the loan. Structure an agreement so that the term of the seller's loan, that is the second mortgage, is of medium range, for example, 5 years. At the end of the loan term, or most likely even sooner, refinance the debt using your equity in the property and use the new loan to pay off the second mortgage. Let's take a look at an example. A seller has a property and because he or she needs a quick sale would be willing to accept $150,000 for it. The property has an appraised value of $175,000 and with some relatively minor improvements you believe it could be appraised for $200,000. It also has an assumable mortgage of $80,000 payable at the rate of $644 per month. The seller wants $20,000 cash at closing and is willing to extend a loan of $50,000 to you in the form of a mortgage at 10%. You have no cash for a down payment and need the seller to loan you the difference between the asking price of $150,000 and the amount of the assumable loan, which is $80,000. To use this technique, you would agree to assume the $80,000 mortgage and offer to pay the seller 15% interest for a period of 5 years on a second mortgage for the remaining $70,000. Now, you may not have to pay 15% interest, but the point here is if you offer a very high interest rate, it may be attractive to the seller. In this way, the seller is receiving a premium rate of interest for accepting a note instead of cash. At or before the end of the 5-year loan term, refinance the entire debt. That is, what remains of the $80,000 assumed mortgage, plus what you owe the seller for the second mortgage. If you're capable of refinancing sooner and paying the seller off, you may be able to negotiate a lower principal balance. You might propose that the seller accept less in the outstanding balance if you pay it off within 15 months. In other words, you owe the seller $70,000 and you've agreed to pay off that mortgage at the end of 5 years. If you were able to pay it off at the end of the first year, perhaps the seller would take $60,000 or $65,000 for that $70,000 mortgage. Under this arrangement, the seller receives a monthly payment of $875, which is $70,000 times 15% divided by 12 months, and they receive that $875 payment for 5 years, all of which is interest paid on that second mortgage. Your total monthly payment for those 5 years is going to be $1,519, which is $644 payment on the assumed loan, plus $875 in interest to the seller. At or before the end of the loan term, you'll refinance, put a new first mortgage on the property that will pay off the first and second mortgage. You may be able to negotiate a reduction in the mortgage balance in exchange for an early payoff, as I mentioned a moment ago. The next technique, combining assumption and a new third-party second mortgage. Now, this technique involves combining an assumption with a third-party second mortgage. It relies on the willingness of the seller to accept an offer that is contingent on your ability to assume the existing loan and obtain a second mortgage on the property. For this technique, the situation is that you are approved for a second mortgage. In other words, a lender is willing to provide financing to assist in your purchase, knowing that the lien will be in a position inferior to another mortgage. The seller has an assumable loan and wants a cash down payment. He or she is willing to accept an offer that is contingent on your ability to obtain a new third-party second mortgage on the property in order to generate the down payment. The source is an institutional or private lender. The strategy is to offer to assume the property's existing first mortgage and pay the balance of the purchase price with the proceeds from a new second mortgage. The contract should be written contingent upon your ability to obtain a second mortgage to cover the balance due after your assumption of the first mortgage. Let's take a look at an example. You found a property on the market for $150,000. It has an existing $125,000 assumable mortgage. The seller has $25,000 in equity. That is $150,000 minus the mortgage of $125,000. And the seller wants to receive all of that equity, that $25,000, in cash. The property's been on the market for 5 months without selling. The owner's getting anxious. To use this technique, you would first offer the seller $145,000, contingent upon being able to locate a new second mortgage. Second, find a lender to loan you $20,000 in the form of a second mortgage on the property. Third, assume the $125,000 first mortgage. By offering to give the seller $20,000 in cash and assume the $125,000 first mortgage, you're proposing to pay $145,000 for the property, $125,000 assumption plus the $20,000 cash. This is not a bad offer for the property considering that the property has been on the market for 5 months. The next technique, combining assumption and a promissory note. This technique enables you to accommodate a seller who requires cash at the closing of a no-down payment transaction. In addition to assuming any existing mortgage, this technique involves creating a promissory note and finding someone to purchase it. Promissory notes can be sold, discounted, or exchanged. Every note has a face value and in some cases is secured by some form of collateral. Discounting a promissory note means selling the note for less than its face value. When you sell a note at a discount, the purchaser of the note usually buys the rights to all future payments generated by the note, both in interest paid on the note and any balance due at the end of the term. There's an active market of investors who are eager to purchase notes at a discount. Your ability to sell a note will depend on the interest rate and the terms of the note, your creditworthiness as the note maker, and the strength of the collateral, if any, is associated with the note. The situation is that you want to purchase a property with an assumable FHA mortgage and provide cash to the seller at closing without putting any money down. The sources of the cash are institutional lender and note buyer. The strategy is to offer to assume the existing mortgage and create a note and locate a note purchaser to purchase the note at the closing. Let's take a look at an example. You find a condominium on the market for $70,000 with an assumable FHA mortgage balance of $60,000. The property appraises for $75,000. The seller is willing to allow the assumption of the first mortgage but wants $10,000 at closing. To use this technique, you would first offer to assume the first mortgage. Second, find an investor who agrees to pay $10,000 cash in return for a promissory note with, say a face value of $15,000 at 12% interest or some high rate of interest, and secured by a second mortgage on the property being purchased. This is an example of a win-win situation where the note purchaser gets an excellent return on his investment with a minimum of risk, the seller receives the cash he needs, and the buyer is able to buy the property without using any of his own cash. However, you should only enter into a transaction like this if the rental income can cover all of the expenses of the two mortgages and still leave you with a positive cash flow. The next technique, defer a portion of the purchase price. In some areas of the country, local real estate prices are such that it is nearly impossible to achieve a break-even or a positive cash flow given prevailing market rental rates. This problem can be overcome either by negotiating no interest or low interest financing by the seller or by deferring a portion of the purchase price. The latter alternative is usually easier to negotiate and works equally well. For this technique, the situation is that you want to buy an income property but prevailing market rent rates make the property not economical unless you can reduce the amount of your monthly payment. The source is the seller. The strategy is to persuade the seller to finance your purchase at low or no interest or defer a portion of the purchase price. Okay, let's take a look at an example. A seller has a 3-bedroom, 2-bath home on the market for $150,000. The property has an existing $105,000 assumable first mortgage. In return for obtaining his or her full asking price, the seller is willing to take back a mortgage for the balance at the going market rate of interest. The fair market rental rate on the property is $1,500 a month. To use this technique, you would first offer to assume the first mortgage. Second, give the seller a second mortgage with 2 notes, totaling $45,000, $150,000 minus $105 is $45,000. One of those notes would be for $20,000 at the market rate of interest, and a second note would be for $25,000, also at a market rate of interest, but with the interest deferred for 6 years. At the end of 6 years, you could refinance the loan by paying off the first mortgage plus both notes, or preferably paying off only the second note for $25,000 plus interest. Ideally, the seller's first note for $20,000, which was a second mortgage, and the new first mortgage would stay on the property. If the second mortgage is to stay on the property after refinancing, the mortgage would have to include a subordination clause that would be inserted at the time you buy the property and sign the mortgage. The next technique, combine a new first mortgage and pledged assets. In this technique, assume you have equity in some real or personal property, for example, stocks or bonds or other securities, maybe a home, a boat, investment property, an automobile, or even vacant land. You can use these assets as collateral for a mortgage that you would offer the seller. This technique is a good alternative to the new first mortgage and seller second mortgage technique. Under this technique, the seller is given collateral in an asset other than the property being sold. You can also establish credibility by demonstrating that you have assets. You may encourage the seller's acceptance by pledging an asset that is free from any liens and will put the seller in first position in the case of default. Make certain you include a substitution of collateral clause in the mortgage. Okay, for this technique, let's look at the situation, the sources, and the strategy. The situation is that you want to buy a property with no money down and you have existing equity and assets, such as stocks and bonds, a home, automobile, vacant land, whatever. The seller is willing to take a promissory note and mortgages on the equity in your existing assets in lieu of a cash down payment on the property. The sources are the equity you have in personal assets and real estate, the seller, and an institutional or private lender as necessary. The strategy is to give the seller a promissory note in lieu of cash for the down payment on the property you want to buy and secure the note with a mortgage on the assets. Use seller financing or a mortgage from an institutional or private lender to pay the balance of the purchase price. Let's take a look at an example. You want to buy a 2-unit property that's on the market for $200,000 on which exists an $87,000 mortgage. The seller's equity is $113,000. $200,000 asking price minus an $87,000 mortgage gives the seller $113,000 in equity. To use this technique, you'd first create a promissory note and mortgage in the amount of $40,000 secured by equity and property that you own, maybe another piece of real estate, for example. Second, offer the $40,000 note to the seller as a down payment on the 2-unit property. Third, obtain a $160,000 first mortgage on the property from an institutional or a private lender. The combination of your promissory note, $40,000, and the first mortgage of $160,000 gives the seller the full $200,000 asking price. As an alternative, you could try to get the seller to take your $40,000 note and a $160,000 wraparound mortgage. You might even offer a little bit higher wraparound mortgage as an incentive for the seller to do this. I'll be describing wraparound mortgages in a moment when I talk about this in a later technique. When you buy this property, you will immediately have $40,000 in equity due to the $40,000 mortgage that is secured by the existing assets that you used as a down payment. If the seller of the 2-unit property is concerned about not receiving any cash at the closing, you can show him or her how to convert the note and mortgage into cash by selling it to someone else. You may also try to sell the note yourself or obtain a secured loan or use a credit card for a down payment. One final comment about this technique. If you have a dead asset, for example, a timeshare, a boat, or a piece of vacant land, you could actually use those assets as a down payment on property, and you'll probably get a much greater price for them than you would if you tried to sell them in the open market. The next technique, combine a new first mortgage with bonds. This technique makes use of the fact that many flexible sellers would rather receive high-quality bonds instead of real estate as collateral for a promissory note. A bond is an interest-bearing or non-interest-bearing certificate issued by a business or government that promises to pay the holder a specified amount on a specified date. The technique works best when you have a relatively low mortgage in relation to the value of the property. Now, when you buy a bond, you're buying a financial instrument that is structured to possess a certain value at a specified date in the future. For example, if you buy a $1,000 bond that matures 10 years from the date of purchase, you're guaranteed by whomever issued the bond that it will be worth $1,000 in 10 years. The amount you pay for the $1,000 bond depends on the interest rates in effect at the time of the purchase, the creditworthiness of the issuer, and the age of the bond. But it might typically be between $500 and $700, especially if it's a zero-interest bond. Now, bonds come in many different forms, including corporate bonds, U.S. government bonds, tax-free bonds. You'll find listings of private corporate bonds, also known as New York Exchange bonds, and U.S. government bonds in the daily edition of the Wall Street Journal. For tax-free bonds, you'll need to contact a stockbroker or a bond broker. In searching for a bond, you should try to find a good, tax-free, zero-interest bond, like a city, state, or county revenue bond, that'll be due in 9 or 10 years. Since these bonds are tax-free, there is no liability for either the seller or for you. For this technique, the situation is that you want to buy a property that has a relatively low ratio of mortgage to property value, and you have equity in another property, or a partner who has equity in a property. The sources are the seller and the bonds. The strategy is to obtain a new first mortgage and use the funds to pay off the existing first mortgage and provide the seller with some cash. Then give the seller the required value in bonds. Let's take a look at an example. The seller has a 4-unit property on the market for $400,000. The existing assumable mortgage on the property is $95,000, so the seller has $305,000 in equity. The seller wants a minimum of $100,000 cash at closing. To use this technique, you would first persuade the seller to accept good quality bonds with a 10-year maturity as collateral for a note. Second, offer to buy the property with $100,000 cash due in 90 days, assume the $95,000 mortgage, and provide the seller with a note secured by bonds worth $205,000 when they mature. Number 3, persuade the seller to deed the property to you with the $305,000 in equity and secure that $305,000 equity that you owe the seller with a note and mortgage with equity on the property you're buying, or with equity in another property, or perhaps a blanket mortgage on equity in both properties, or even bringing in a third property belonging to a friend or partner. Number 4, once you become the owner of the property, obtain a new $340,000 first mortgage. Here's how we're going to use the proceeds. First, use $95,000 to pay off the existing first mortgage. Use $140,000 approximately to buy the $205,000 worth of bonds that are going to be due in 10 years. $100,000 will be given to the seller, and you might keep $5,000 cash for yourself. Of course, the amount of cash you'll have will depend on the actual cost of the bonds as well as the closing costs for the new mortgage. As a result of this series of transactions, the seller receives $100,000 cash down payment and owns a note secured by bonds that are going to be worth $205,000 when they mature in 10 years. You now own a $400,000 property with a $340,000 mortgage, and you have $60,000 in equity in that property. In addition, you may have put approximately $5,000 in your pocket. The next technique, use a wraparound mortgage. When you use a wraparound mortgage, you give a promissory note and a second mortgage on the property to the seller in lieu of cash. The seller retains and continues to pay the underlying first mortgage on the property, which is usually much less than the new second mortgage, and uses the payments received from you on the second mortgage to make the ongoing payments on the first mortgage. When the underlying first mortgage is paid off, the second mortgage automatically moves to first position. For this technique, first, the situation is that you want to buy the property without a cash down payment. The seller is willing to take back a promissory note and mortgage from you for the entire purchase price while retaining his or her underlying first mortgage on the property. The source is the seller. The strategy is to give the seller a note and second mortgage for the entire purchase price of the property. Let's take a look at an example. Let's say the seller of a property currently valued at $150,000 acquired the property 14 years ago for $70,000. To buy the property, he made a cash down payment of $5,000 and financed the remaining $65,000 over 25 years at 8.5% interest. As a result, his assumable mortgage loan on the property calls for 300 monthly payments of $524 each, including principal and interest. To date, he's made 168 payments, and the mortgage is paid down to $44,793 on the original $65,000 loan. Therefore, his current equity is $105,207. We got that by taking the property value of $150,000 and subtracting the current money owed on the mortgage of $44,793. To use this technique, you would first offer the seller a note for $150,000 that's secured by a second wraparound mortgage on the property. The note would be paid off over 25 years at 8.5% interest, which works out to 300 monthly payments of $1,208 each, including principal and interest. Second, obligate the seller to continue making his own monthly payments on the underlying first mortgage using your payments to him to do this. The difference between your monthly payment to the seller of $1,208 and the seller's monthly payment on the first mortgage of $524 results in a $684 monthly cash flow for the seller. So 11 years from the date after you purchased the property, the seller will have paid off the underlying first mortgage, and you will have paid off $31,650 of your second wraparound mortgage to the seller. The remaining balance of your wraparound mortgage will be $118,350. Remember, $150,000 was the starting point, minus $31,650 equals $118,350. Now recall that the seller's equity in the property was $105,207, and that in turn was his equity in the mortgage when you gave him a wraparound mortgage. The difference between the wraparound and the first mortgage was $105,207. So, after 11 years, the seller's equity in the mortgage will have grown from $105,207 to $118,350, a 12.5% increase, and in the meantime, the seller was enjoying an annual cash flow of $8,208, 12 times $684 a month positive cash flow. If you're listening to this audio chapter without benefit of having your manual at hand, these numbers may seem, somewhat confusing or overwhelming to you. Don't worry about it. This is such a powerful technique. Go back to the manual, read through the example, and you'll really see it's not all that difficult. This technique allows you to buy a property with no money down without incurring the cost and liability associated with assuming a first mortgage. However, be sure to establish your right to know if the first mortgage is being paid. You see, you're paying the seller each month on the wraparound second mortgage. You want to make sure that he or she is paying the first mortgage. You could accomplish this by either having an escrow agent collect and disperse funds, or you could break your monthly payments into two payments. One you would send to the seller, and one you would send to the first mortgage. Again, a very powerful and, once you become familiar with it, very simple and straightforward technique. The next technique, using a blanket mortgage. A blanket mortgage includes collateral in addition to the property being purchased. For example, you can include equity in your home, another investment property, or even an automobile as part of a blanket mortgage. Blanket mortgages come in handy when you encounter a seller willing to finance the entire purchase if they're given assurance that you will not default on the loan. The seller may be afraid that the property will be returned to him in a worse condition than when it was sold, or that he or she will have to go to the trouble and expense of selling the property all over again. By including equity in property you already own as part of the mortgage on the property, you're really providing additional security for the seller. For this technique, the situation is that you want to buy a property with no money down. The seller is willing to finance the entire price of the property, but is afraid that you will walk away from the loan before you've built up substantial equity in the property. The sources are the seller and the equity in your existing assets, and the strategy is to give the seller a note for the entire purchase price of the property, using as collateral the property you're buying as well as equity in other property that you own. Let's take a look at an example here. You locate a house in your neighborhood that's been vacant for some time and needs exterior painting. You research the property and get the name and number of the owner and find out there is no mortgage on the property. When you contact the owner, you learn that it's a senior citizen who is interested in selling, but has not listed the property with a real estate broker. You schedule an interior inspection and determine that the property requires only cosmetic repairs and is habitable in its current condition. Your market analysis reveals the property is worth $90,000. You determine through conversation with the seller that the property is clearly a burden for him. He tells you that he's a retired teacher and is looking to move closer to family that lives out of state. You take into consideration the rent you'd be able to charge for the unit, as well as the repairs you would like to make, and negotiate a purchase price of $73,000. You offer to pay the purchase price in the form of a seller carryback or a purchase money mortgage. The seller raises concerns about what's going to happen if you don't pay on the mortgage or maintain the property. He wishes to retire and move away and is fearful about the possibility of having to foreclose on the property or take it back once the transaction closes. Let's take a look at how we'd use this technique. First, explain to the seller that you will make the mortgage payments to him on time. Second, if you have a current mortgage on a piece of property and you've paid on the mortgage over a long period of time, you could provide the seller with a copy of your mortgage history, which you can order from your lender. This history is going to show the amount and timeliness of your payments. Number 3, present the seller with a blanket mortgage on the seller's property, as well as another piece of property that you own that has $30,000 in equity. The seller now has the option to foreclose not only on the property you're buying from him, but on the other piece of property as well. This should give the seller considerable peace of mind. The result of all of this, you have purchased a property with no money down, and the seller has confidence about extending financing to you because of the additional property you mortgaged as security. The next technique, combining an assumption and a net deal. In a net deal, the seller gets a certain net cash for the property. When a seller's equity in a property is very small, this approach to purchasing the property is extremely effective. All the costs of closing are paid by the buyer, including transfer taxes, recording fees, title insurance, real estate brokerage commissions, home inspections, and in many cases, even the taxes for the year. The seller knows that whatever amount of money or notes that you offer over and above any debt on the property is the amount that the seller is going to have at the time he leaves the closing. This method of buying real estate has several advantages. First, if there's a brokerage commission, it might be calculated on a smaller selling price, so there may be some savings. Second, if the broker is willing to take the commission in the form of a note, the actual cash required can be minimal. For this technique, the situation is that you want to buy a property in which the seller has little equity and you're willing to pay the closing costs. The sources could be any of those I've described. The strategy is to propose to the seller that you pay for the closing cost in exchange for consideration on the size of the required down payment. Let's take a look at an example. A seller has a property on the market listed with an agent for $160,000, and the seller wants $6,000 to use as a down payment on a home in another state. To use this technique, you would, 1, offer the seller $4,000 for the property net and agree to assume the debt. Second, agree to pay the real estate commission in the form of a note in the amount of $8,640. We arrived at that figure by taking the selling price of the property, that is the $140,000 mortgage plus $4,000 cash to the seller, or $144,000, multiplying it times the 6% brokerage commission. We also agree to pay all the transfer taxes, title insurance, and recording fees, expenses that you estimate will cost $1,400. So your total purchase price is going to be $154,040. A $140,000 mortgage, a broker's commission of $8,640, which remember we're paying in note form, plus $4,000 cash to the seller, plus $1,400 in closing costs, with a cash out of pocket of $5,400, $4,000 cash to the seller plus $1,400 in closing costs. In all of the techniques presented, it's useful to determine what the seller wants to net from the transaction. That is, in essence, what they're really trying to accomplish. It also serves as a helpful negotiation tool because if you meet resistance, you can show the seller how you devise a solution that nets the desired result that the seller is looking for. The next technique, negotiate purchase credits. This technique employs the use of security deposits, rent credits, and real estate tax credits to reduce the amount of cash required for the down payment on an income property. Now, sometimes these credits can be substantial enough to allow you to end up taking out cash at the time of closing. If not, they can certainly cut down on the amount of cash needed at the close. Let's take a look at these. When a tenant signs a lease, they're almost always required to put down a security deposit against any damage that might be done to the property during the term of the lease. In addition, some landlords, like me I might add, collect the final month's rent at the lease signing. Such security deposits in the final month's rent must be turned over to the buyer at the closing. Also, the buyer receives credit for part of the rent collected in the current month. For example, if you close on an income property on the 10th of the month, you'll receive credit for the last 20 or 21 days, which is approximately 2/3 of the month's rent. If you close on the first day of the month, you'll either receive the rents collected already by the seller or will immediately collect the rents yourself. In addition to security deposits and rents collected at closing, you'll also receive a credit for unpaid real estate taxes. Real estate taxes are generally paid in arrears, which means that the seller is always behind in paying taxes. For example, real estate taxes for the current year are due and payable late in the year or sometimes even the next year. Thus, the buyer receives a credit for the real estate taxes that have been accrued but have not been billed prior to the closing. The credits from security deposits and last month's rents and collected rents and unpaid real estate taxes will all be used to reduce the amount of cash required for the down payment, and sometimes these credits are substantial. On a 10-unit building, for example, there might be $7,000 in security deposits, 10 times $700, last month's rents of 10 times the monthly rent rate, and an additional credit for unpaid real estate taxes of $10,000 to $15,000. In such circumstances, it would not be unusual for credits on a 10-unit building to exceed $20,000. For this technique, the situation is that you're purchasing an income property and want to pay little or no money down on the property. The sources are tenant security deposits, last month's rent, collected rents, and unpaid real estate taxes. The strategy is to use the credits that are due to you as the buyer to reduce the amount of your down payment on the property. Let's look at an example. You purchase a 10-unit building, each unit of which rents at $600 per month. At closing on the first day of the month, you will immediately receive credit for any collected rents. And if you don't receive that credit at closing, you'll soon receive the rents immediately after closing, and that will total $6,000, 10 times 600. You'll get a credit for security deposits of $7,000, that is 10 times 700, and you'll get a credit for the last month's rent of $6,000, 10 times 600. Real estate taxes on the property are $10,000 per year, and at closing you are to receive a real estate tax credit of $8,000. As a result, at the closing, you're going to be receiving $27,000 in funds and credits, the sum of $6,000 for the rent, $7,000 for a security deposit, and $6,000 for last month's rent, plus $8,000 for real estate taxes not yet billed. To use this technique, you would use the $27,000 in credits due at closing to pay or reduce the required down payment on the property, or if possible, to allow you to take out cash at closing. If you're obtaining a new mortgage on the property, you can use the rent you collect at the end of your first month of ownership to pay your first mortgage payment, which will not be due until the first day of the following month, when you'll be receiving another month's rent. If you're assuming an existing mortgage for which the payment is due mid-month, you can talk to the lender about moving the mortgage payment ahead to the first day of the following month. You'll probably be required to pay 1/2 month's interest on the mortgage, but you'll benefit by receiving as much as 1/2 month's rent payments. This extra cash can be used for a down payment on another property. You could use it for fixing up the income property or even for your personal use. The next technique. Negotiate a position of a private first mortgage and use a new first mortgage. In this technique, you get the holder of a private mortgage on a property you want to buy to move his or her mortgage from a senior or first position to a junior or second position. This enables you to obtain a new first mortgage to buy the property. The technique works well when the private mortgage holder is not willing to discount the mortgage in return for a complete payoff. For this technique, the situation is that you want to buy a property with no money down. A senior mortgage holder is willing to move the mortgage from a senior to a junior position in exchange for a partial payoff of the loan amount. The source is an institutional and/or private lender. The strategy is to offer to pay off part of the private mortgage in exchange for getting it moved from a senior to a junior position. You'd obtain a new first or senior mortgage on the property and use the funds to pay the private mortgage holder the agreed-upon payment and to pay the seller for his or her equity in the property. Let's take a look. A seller has a property on the market for $150,000. And before I go any further, let me comment. I know in many areas of the country the median price for a home is more than $150,000. In some areas it's less. And we use $150,000 because it's an easy number to work with, and hopefully it'll make it easier for you to understand the examples. So a seller has a property on the market for $150,000, and there's an existing private first mortgage on the property in the amount of $75,000. To use this technique, you would first ask the private mortgage holder to move his or her mortgage from a first or senior position to a second or junior position in return for a payment of cash, say $25,000. This $25,000 payment reduces the private mortgage from $75,000 to $50,000. Agree to make the $25,000 payment only after a new first mortgage is secured. Second, you put a new $100,000 first mortgage on the property. You use $25,000 of the money received from the first mortgage to pay the private mortgage holder for moving the mortgage position. After you make the payment, you'll still owe the private mortgage holder $50,000, but now in the form of a second mortgage. After you take $25,000 out of the new first mortgage of $100,000, that'll leave $75,000, and you put the remaining $75,000 of the new first mortgage money into the seller's pocket to purchase the property. At the end of this series of transactions, you will have assumed the $50,000 private mortgage, now reduced from $75,000 to $50,000. In addition, you will have paid the seller $75,000 in cash for the property, thereby giving the seller his or her asking price of $150,000. How did we arrive at that? There was an assumable private loan on the property of $75,000, plus in the end we gave the seller $75,000 in cash. You're going to owe $100,000 to the holder of the new first mortgage and $50,000 to the holder of the now second private mortgage for a total of $150,000. Like several other examples, this is not difficult to follow if you have your manual in front of you, and if not, review this technique later when you have the manual. The next technique, negotiating a discount purchase and using a new first mortgage. In this technique, you pay cash for a property in order to purchase it at a substantial discount. Then you take out a loan on the property to recover your cash. The net result is that you purchase a property without tying up your own cash for the long term. When you refinance, you'll recoup your cash, resulting in a no-down payment deal. For this technique, the situation is that you have cash available to you. The seller is in need of cash and is anxious to sell. The sources are your available cash and an institutional or private lender. The strategy is to buy the seller's property at a substantial discount relative to its fair market value, then take out a loan on the property to recover your cash. Let's look how this might work. You find a property that's worth $90,000 and will appraise for that amount. The seller needs to close quickly and is willing to accept less than the market value for a cash offer. You have access to $80,000 in cash. To use this technique, you would first offer to purchase the property for $75,000 cash with a quick closing date. Second, after the closing, obtain a loan amount equal to or greater than 90% of the appraised value. When you finance the property, you will recoup your purchase funds and your closing costs, and you may even be able to borrow more than you paid. If you or one or more partners have access to sizable amounts of cash, this technique is an outstanding way to purchase property. However, it requires that you find a seller who is in need of cash and very anxious to sell. In one case, for example, I was contacted by a seller who needed to sell his property immediately and was willing to sell at a substantial discount if I paid all cash and closed on the property within 3 days. Because I had an excellent relationship with a title insurance company and had some cash in the bank, I was able to do just that. I bought the property at a discount for approximately 75% of its fair market value. Then, by putting a new loan on the property, I was able to take 100% of the cash out that I'd invested. Sometimes, after taking title of the property and making a few minor repairs, you can refinance the property and take out even more cash than you invested. Technique number 15. Negotiate a discount purchase. With this technique, you would acquire a physically distressed home, rehabilitate it, then put it on the market for its new appreciated value. The situation is that you want to purchase and rehabilitate a home. The source, an institutional lender or partners. The strategy is to negotiate and purchase the home below market value because of its distressed condition and appearance, and then rehabilitate the home and sell the home for its new, after fix-up, appreciated value. Let's look at an example. You found a physically distressed home for which the seller is asking $70,000. It will require $10,000 to rehabilitate the home, but you estimate the rehabilitated home will be worth $120,000 based on appreciation and the fact that it is being purchased below market value now. To use this technique, you would first negotiate to purchase the home for $60,000 using your credit or the credit or cash of an investor or equity partner. 2. Spend $10,000 to rehabilitate the home. 3. Put the home on the market for $120,000. Assuming you're able to sell for $120,000, your total profit will be $50,000. That's $120,000 minus the $60,000 you paid, minus the $10,000 cost of rehabilitating the home. Properties like this are not as uncommon as you might think, and you can be well paid for keeping your eyes open for these types of opportunities. The next technique, using investors and a new first mortgage. This technique involves joining with others to strengthen your loan approval capabilities. You may find that such a venture will enable you to get higher loan amounts or lower rates of interest or both. The investor may co-sign on the loan or even take sole responsibility to provide you with the most desirable loan terms. The participation of each individual is open to negotiation and may be provided for in limitless ways. For this technique, the situation is that you join with an investor whose income or credit will allow you to obtain loan terms that you couldn't achieve alone. The sources are the investor and an institutional lender. The strategy is to find an investor with credit or income that enables you to purchase a desirable property. Let's look at an example. You find a bank foreclosed home, that's an REO, in a very desirable community that is listed considerably below its market value. The home is being offered for $185,000, but with minor cosmetic repairs, you believe it could sell for $250,000 or more. Your mortgage broker informs you that you have insufficient credit lines to be approved for more than 50% of the purchase price. The bank that owns the property refuses to sell the property on contract, extend a loan to you, or lease with option to buy. You discuss this property with a potential investor, and the investor is interested in partnering with you to make a profit on the eventual sale of the home. The investor agrees to purchase the home for $185,000 and in turn lease the home to you with an option to buy for $220,000. It's also agreed that the investor will request a $7,500 repair credit from the seller, that's the bank, in the purchase offer. To use this technique, you would first locate an investment opportunity that will provide adequate compensation for you and an investor. Second, partner with someone who is capable of obtaining or joining you in qualifying for the desired loan terms. Bank-owned properties are often sold below market value to achieve a quick sale. In this instance, you take advantage of the situation and receive instant equity and a no-money down purchase. The use of partners can open a wide range of real estate investment opportunities. I've dedicated the chapter titled Working with Partners to this subject. The next technique, using rental participation. This technique involves offering the seller of an income property the chance to participate in any profit you might make by increasing the rents in exchange for his or her flexibility in terms and financing. Such flexibility can take various forms, including allowing you to purchase the property with no money down, financing the property or by giving you a low-interest loan, or even offering you a moratorium of interest paid on such a loan. For this technique, the situation is that you're purchasing an income property and want to persuade the seller to consider a flexible financing option. The sources are future profits from the income property and the seller. The strategy: to offer the seller the chance to participate in future profits from rent increases in exchange for his or her flexibility in your purchase of the property. Let's take a look at an example. Assume you're negotiating to purchase a property that rents for $1,000 per month. That is $12,000 a year. To use this technique, you would first offer to pay the seller a negotiated percentage, perhaps between 20 and 50%, of any annual rental income that exceeds $12,000 per year, for a specified period of time in exchange for a reduction in the down payment required on the property, a low-interest seller finance loan, or a moratorium on interest paid on such a loan. The seller's participation in future profits due to rent increases is a reward for his or her flexibility. In essence, the seller participates in the rewards of the property. This technique is especially attractive to sellers with income property in need of repairs that are located in developing areas. The next technique, using land contracts. This technique calls for the purchaser to pay for all or most of the property before he or she receives the legal title. In its simplest form, a land contract, which by the way is also known as an agreement for deed, a contract for deed, or an installment contract, these contracts work like a mortgage, except that the legal title does not pass to the purchaser until a specified number of payments have been made. This form of seller financing is quite popular in some parts of the country, yet practically unheard of in others. Theoretically, this technique provides additional protection for the seller in the event of default. If the purchaser does not make the payments as agreed, the land contract usually stipulates that the payments that have been made up to the date of the default are forfeited. In most states, the seller is required to foreclose on the contract through a process which is similar to foreclosure. This process affords some protection of the buyer's interest in the property. To provide notice of the agreement to a third party, the land contract or an affidavit and memorandum of agreement should be recorded in the public records. Land contracts specify the amount and number of the payments to be made. The payments are usually specified to be made monthly, with the money applied first to interest on the purchase price, second to charges such as real estate taxes, insurance, and special assessments, if any, and third to the unpaid principal balance of the purchase price. The contract might call for such payments to be made for an agreed-upon period of time, for example 10 years, 1 year, or even as little as 30 days before legal title passes to the purchaser. If the contract states that the legal title will pass to the purchaser before the principal balance is paid in full, a balloon payment will usually become due. However, the seller can take back a note and mortgage in lieu of the balloon payment if that's the negotiated agreement. For this technique, the situation is that you want to buy a property that has a mortgage for little or no money down, and the seller refuses to take back a wraparound mortgage. In addition, you might have bad credit. The seller is security-minded, but does not need to receive cash at closing and is interested in receiving a regular monthly income. The source is the seller. The strategy is to persuade the seller to accept a land contract on the property. Write the land contract so that it specifies that after making regular payments for a specific period of time, you will take legal title to the property. Let's take a look at an example. You have found a 2-unit property that is listed for $200,000 on which there exists a first mortgage of $100,000. The monthly payment on the mortgage is $772. The owner is asking for a $30,000 cash down payment and has expressed a willingness to take back a wraparound mortgage for $170,000 at 9%. Through negotiation, you've convinced the seller to accept $180,000 for the property. You know that you can rent both units for a total of $2,400 per month. To use this technique, you would, first, persuade the seller to sell the property on a land contract. Second, persuade the seller to take a $25,000 down payment in the form of 6 semi-annual payments of $4,167, each at 0% interest, beginning 6 months from the date of close. This request is not really unreasonable because a land contract protects a seller more than if he or she gave you legal title to the property at the time of closing. Specify in the land contract that you'll pay the seller $155,000 at 8% interest only for 5 years, at the end of which time you will take legal title to the property. Your monthly payments will be $1,033. Even with the added monthly payment for taxes and insurance, which we'll assume to be $567, your total cash out of pocket will be $1,600 per month. Since the rental income is $2,400 per month, you will have approximately $460 per month of positive cash flow, even after subtracting a 10% management fee and $100 per month cost for maintenance. This transaction is clearly a win-win situation for both parties. You're buying the property with very little money down. The seller has received more than 90% of their asking price, has the security of knowing that they've not conveyed legal title to the property to you, and still has an income, including your semi-annual payments, of over $20,700 per year, which equates to roughly $1,700 per month. The next technique is using lease options. This technique involves obtaining a lease on a property with the option to purchase a property in the future. This is one of the most cost-effective win-win purchase strategies available. You can obtain the property with no money down, and the seller will receive rent while awaiting payment of the option price. Because of the numerous opportunities this technique offers, I've dedicated the entire next chapter to a more thorough discussion of the concepts involved. For this technique, the situation is that the seller wants to sell or is willing to rent. The source is consideration for the option to purchase and the seller. The strategy is to negotiate a lease on the property with an option to purchase the property. Let's look at an example. The seller is willing to sell or lease a home that you estimate has a fair market value of $170,000. The seller will rent the house for $1,450 per month or sell for $160,000. To use this technique, you would offer a lease option paying $1,500 per month, with $500 per month counting as a credit toward the $160,000 purchase price. The option can be exercised anytime within the next 5 years. If you wait for 5 years to exercise your option, you will owe $130,000. 60 months at $500 gives you a credit of $30,000 toward the purchase price of $160,000. If the property increases in value 5% per year, which is the approximate national average over the last decade or so, it would be worth $200,000 based on the purchase price of $160,000. Not a bad deal at all. You have, in effect, bought the $160,000 home no money down, although I will add you probably will have had to put down a security deposit as option consideration that might be equal to 1 or 2 months' rent. Paid an effective interest rate of 7.5%. We got that by taking $1,000 per month times 12, which equals $12,000, and dividing that by a $160,000 option price, which equals 7.5%. If for some reason at the end of the lease you don't want to purchase the house, in the unlikely event that the house has gone down in value, very unlikely, but you can simply walk away from the property. I describe the benefits and opportunities of lease options in the chapter titled Using Lease Options. Okay, let's recap what I've covered in this audio chapter. The creative financing techniques presented in this chapter are proven. They've worked for me, and they work for thousands of my students. Your awareness and understanding of the techniques presented will allow you to recognize which opportunities best lend themselves to the use of each particular technique or combination of techniques. With the right tools, any job is made easier. The techniques described in this chapter are the tools for success in real estate investment. But like the tools in your toolbox, they won't work if you don't use them. So I encourage you to study and master these techniques. Doing so will greatly assist you in reaching your success goals.